Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just wrapped up talking about Justin Fields and what his future could potentially look like. One team that has been talked about in terms of a potential landing spot for Justin Fields has been the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, whether or not that's going to become an actual reality is still very much in the air, but the fact remains that there is a little bit of a question mark at the quarterback position with the Pittsburgh Steelers. They have Kenny Pickett, who they drafted in the first round a couple years ago, Mason Rudolph, who ended the season for them as their starting quarterback. He is an upcoming free agent. So there's a lot of different things to weigh here. Manny, as a Steelers fan yourself, what do you think the Steelers should be looking to do this offseason at that position?
I think what they're going to be doing is looking for the competition now. Whether I agree with, the options that are out there that have been rumored, it's a different feeling from my perspective, because I think that the more likely options probably seem to be, Russell Wilson. I've seen a lot more Jimmy G's options coming out as well. And there's also, the Ryan Tannehill one, just because Arthur Smith is there. Ryan Tannehill arguably had one of his better years under Arthur Smith with the Titans and the time they had in Tennessee. So that all makes sense. But I think whoever it ends up being, whether it be somebody maybe through the draft, someone younger, I think it has to be someone with solid threat to some extent with Kenny Pickett to at least compete with him for that position, just because he is the only quarterback under contract with the Steelers now. And I don't think it'd be a good thing if he came into this year, expecting just to get the job. I think there needs to be a little bit of a fire lit under him to some extent, just because he has something to prove now. He's been injured the last 2 years. The numbers obviously haven't been great, but that could all, to be fair to Kenny, it could all be the offensive coordinator, the switching of personnel, the offensive line not being the best. All that plays into his favor. So now you get a fresh start with everything. And I think you need a good competition in there for Kenny to realize that, this is a big year for him to prove it, or else, next year could be looking a lot different for him.
Yeah, definitely. I think not necessarily benefit of the doubt, but you do look sort of at those surrounding situations. We just talked about what Justin Fields went through and some of these other young quarterbacks. Feels like the quarterback development through the league hasn't exactly been necessarily the best with a lot of these front offices. And Pickett's an interesting case because he came in the 2022 class where the quarterbacks weren't necessarily seen to be quite as high ceiling. So he was the first quarterback selected, but at the 20th overall pick, as opposed to a year before. And we just talked about that 21 draft class where 5 quarterbacks went in the first 15 picks. So obviously the pedigree of prospect that Pickett was in comparison to some of these other guys wasn't necessarily quite as high, but I think that he has gotten a little bit of a bad rep from a lot of the media and a lot of the NFL fans. It's really interesting. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that whole Matt Canada offense, because the Steelers don't typically fire their coordinators mid-season, but they did so with Matt Canada. There was a tremendous amount of public outcry for his job. So how much of specifically that stretch up through November where they were outgained, I should say, in their first 10 games, how much do you think that was on Canada? How much should Pickett be held accountable?
I think just breaking it up from the games that I saw, I think most of it undoubtedly probably went to Canada. And I think that was fair because, Kenny could only improvise so much. There was a lot of times where it seemed like he was just holding it, waiting a lot of times for someone to get open. And, like most fans would know that watch any of the games, if the concept and everything isn't right and no one's open, the quarterback can only do so much before either the players either improvise with him, try to get open themselves, or, a lot of times the receivers would just stand around because of the routes that they ran and everything. There was a lot of on the exterior, ran routes. There wasn't really much in the middle, and I think a lot of times just Kenny would either try to force something or it was a miscommunication with things. And I just think a lot of that falls to the coaching, not communicating to everyone to be on the same page, not making sure the details are honed in. All that stuff, I think, fell on Canada. And I think they obviously got to the point where he was dismissed. And I think Mike Tomlin really had no choice because he saw the way everything was trending. And it got better that first week when they played the Bengals. I think they had their first 400-yard game in a long time. And then it kind of stuttered because he got injured, and then you never really found a footing after that. So I think it's fair only at this point to have it fall on Matt Canada. But like I mentioned before, it's coming to that time where Kenny Pickett's the one that remained, and he has to kind of prove it now.
Yeah, he's definitely in this prove it phase of his career where I don't think he's necessarily done anything himself to lose his job. All in all, he's been just very solid. And like solid is even a little bit of a word you can have with interpretation. He hasn't been very mistake prone. He only threw 4 interceptions last year across his 12 games. But did have a negative touchdown to interception ratio in his rookie year. And that's the thing is I think that there's definitely a smartness to him. I think that he's not super mistake prone. It's just, it doesn't seem like he really moves the needle all too much in terms of elevating a team. And that's something, they have some solid young receivers. They have a pretty good backfield as well. Now, Canada, again, the predictability of the offense last year at times and the play calling definitely handicapped them a good amount. But I think that when evaluating Pickett, it is really interesting. And now you have, amongst all the other offseason rumors in terms of guys they could go out and get, you had a report from a few days ago where a Steelers beat reporter said that some of the wide receivers were actually, clamoring for the Steelers to bring back Mason Rudolph as the starting quarterback for next year. Now he is an upcoming free agent. What are your thoughts on the idea of trying to run this back with Mason Rudolph?
I think it would just go back to that competition aspect I mentioned before, because, if Kenny hasn't seen those reports, if he has seen them, it doesn't really matter, because once you see Mason Rudolph come back, they brought him back for a reason. If you're thinking as Kenny Pickett, you might be thinking, all right, they brought him back, they must see something in him. And then at that point, really becomes a competition. And if I'm Kenny Pickett, I'm thinking, this guy just can't come in here and take my spot. I think it'll light a fire under him. And, Mason played very well at the end of the year. I think he kind of knew that he was playing with really nothing to lose. He was the backup, the third string, even the majority of the season.
Yeah, Mitch Trubisky got a start before he did during last year. Trubisky, not gonna trash the guy, but we kind of know.
There's not much to be said there, and he wasn't really playing with anything. He proved a lot of people probably wrong, surprised a lot of people in the Steelers organization, especially, I think. And if they brought him back, I think not only would it be beneficial to Kenny, but to Mason as well. He's proven that he could play there just this past season, and it would be a pretty interesting competition throughout the preseason and, leading up to the official games.
Yeah, I think when you talk about sort of quarterback development specifically, competition is a good thing. Now, you do when you bring in a guy and you are expecting him to be your next franchise quarterback, you want to have him, comfortable in his role and have confidence, but especially a couple years in, it can't be, everything is given to you. Now, where you sort of draw that line of the competition, like as a Patriots fan, I thought that the way that Belichick sort of treated Mac Jones as he was dealing with some of the injuries he was last year and this whole Zappe mania, I wasn't a fan of it because I didn't think that Zappe ever really had what it took to be a real starting quarterback. Now, Mason Rudolph, he at least won some of these games down the stretch, and while I'm not the biggest Mason Rudolph guy myself, I do think that there's something to be said for the team, whether it was because they were getting further from this Matt Canada offense or it was Mason Rudolph himself. The offense did look better. They were winning more games down the stretch of the year. I think, though, when I look at last season, I know that it wasn't pretty for Kenny Pickett, but he came up big at the end of games where obviously you can't just take the last 2-3 minutes of the game and weigh them that much more heavily than the rest of the game, especially the way that these Steelers games played out, where it was a lot of a lull for most of the game. But he led 3 game-winning drives last year and made some really impressive throws. That's when you saw some of more of the explosive stuff. So whether it's other defenses getting tired and the Steelers having those, bigger athleticism, higher ceiling receivers on the outside, like Pickett, or Pickens, I should say. But, I did think that there was something there that they just couldn't get to in terms of consistency throughout an entire game. But I'm at least intrigued by him as the idea of sort of sticking with it. Now, you mentioned off the air when we were talking about Teddy Bradshaw, where he had made some comments about the Steelers' upcoming quarterback decision. What did you have on that?
Yeah, I had the quote up here. He was on the Rich Eisen show, and anybody connected to the Steelers, Rich Eisen asked him what he thought about the whole Kenny Pickett situation. He said, "I love Pickett. I know him well, and he's fiercely competitive. He's a tough-minded kid. Things don't really bother him. I really like him a lot." And, just showing his support for Kenny Pickett. And then he ultimately said that he felt that he deserved the chance. He felt that it was his job still, even after, getting injured and bringing in Mason Rudolph and everything. And then, it kind of developed into asking him about Justin Fields. And I thought the most interesting part of it was that he said, it'd be a huge mistake to trade for Justin Fields. Which I thought it was pretty interesting on that, because I don't think there's anything wrong with competition like we've discussed already. And, just the idea of giving Kenny Pickett the keys to the offense and everything after not having the most impressive of numbers, I don't really agree with that, but I can see where he's coming from because, everyone deserves the opportunity to get this fresh start with the new staff, offensive coordinator coming in. We do have to see Kenny play for, a certain amount of time this offseason. And I just thought it was interesting to see what Terry thought about it and, really not buying into all that Justin Fields trade talk.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're going to touch on Justin Fields. I think that that's a very interesting thought experiment. But you look at the Steelers as a whole right now, I feel like the offensive line is a pretty big need for them to make some upgrades at, because with the backfield that they have, I've been, kind of so-so on Najee, but he's a good player. I just, drafted in the first round. I don't feel like he's maybe fully lived up to the prospect that he was, but I love Jaylen Warren as that sort of 1-2 punch as well. And you bring in Arthur Smith. You talked about the way that he was sort of able to help elevate Ryan Tannehill during those Tennessee years. And what he did last year, I know that as a head coach, he was a little bit of a mess. I didn't like him in that position, but as a strictly offensive coordinator, I think he brings a very interesting quarterback-friendly, at times, scheme with the amount of play action that they run. We saw that in Tennessee heavily. We saw them sort of incorporate that as well again last year. And I think that the Steelers could potentially have a very, again, at least upgrading from Matt Canada, who the rates that he was calling play action passes was extremely low, and putting a lot on Kenny Pickett's plate himself to make these plays, as opposed to helping him from a schematic standpoint. So I think letting him sort of come into the team next year and get a little bit of a reset with a new offensive coordinator could definitely benefit him. But on the note of Justin Fields, you sort of alluded to the fact of, as a fan, you don't think it's realistic. But what do you think, let's say hypothetically, they were to add Justin Fields? How would you feel about that, and do you think that it would be a good fit for him?
I think it would be as good as it was with Ryan Tannehill, just because athletically, you could say he's more athletic than Kenny. He uses his legs a lot more. He sort of has a Jalen Hurts sort of build. Very athletic, very heavy, bulky build to him. He can use his legs very well. With Arthur Smith, I think if he were to be there with Arthur Smith, I think it would just enhance the running game, because now you have three options if you really want to back there that could end up carrying the ball. And throwing the ball, I know a lot of people aren't really the biggest fan of him throwing wise, and he definitely has to develop that a little bit more. But I think with the Steelers, they're really switching over to being a more running team, and I think that'll help him, with the play action like you mentioned. Arthur Smith is heavy on that. And if he can hit those throws, which will be a lot easier for him to hit there in Pittsburgh with the system, the running backs, I think it'll help him a lot. And I truly believe it'll be a good situation for both of them, just because their profiles fit pretty well with one another.
Yeah. Well, that is all the time we have for you today, but thank you very much for joining. We can catch the Chip Shot Football Podcast at what time tonight?
6:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
All right. Well, great stuff from Manny. Thank you so much again for joining the show. We are going to be taking a break here. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be switching gears to some more NBA conversations. But thanks a lot for joining us, Manny, and we will be right back.